It's a real pleasure to be speaking to everybody today. I've felt sort of one of the little elves in the background of an awful lot of this stuff, and so really pleased to be able to share with you some of the thinking that went into at least some aspects of the trial. I'm happy if you want to use the chat function to sort of pose any questions or Q&A as we go along, or if there's anything that I haven't explained clearly. This is also being recorded, so if there's something you missed, we can go back. Some of the things I'll say will have references to them, to literature and that type of thing. If you want a URL or a PDF, feel free to reach out. So great. So as Mark said, my name's Paul. I'm a neuropsychologist by training. My research expertise is actually nothing to do with infectious diseases or anything like that. I actually specialize in motor neuron disease and have been studying that for about 20 years. And actually through that, I got very involved in digital health because, as you may know, people with serious conditions like MND, if you think of Stephen Hawking as the sort of prototypical patient, often use the internet and they use technology to communicate with one another. And so I've spent a lot of my career building digital networks that connect patients up, but with the idea not just of giving them peer support, which is very important, but also giving them tools to allow them to manage their condition. So using things like patient-reported outcome measures or PROMs. And where that ended up taking me is into the world of decentralized clinical trials. So actually taking those platforms that were being used for conversations and research and actually using that for clinical trials. So when Charlotte Summers and Mark got in touch with me, they were sort of saying, well, one of the aspects we're really interested in is digital health as much as this sort of patient-reported outcome measures aspect. So that's the bit I sort of got corralled into supporting, and it's been an absolute pleasure working with the team. So today I'm going to take you through a couple of different things. So first of all, this may be familiar territory to you, but I want to give you a perspective maybe broader than even sort of academically funded research in the UK, to think about how the people I work with in, say, the pharmaceutical industry or contract research organizations, funders, that type of thing, have been thinking about patient involvement more broadly in clinical trials, not just in the UK, but the US and elsewhere. I'm going to try and take you behind the scenes of patient involvement work that went into Heal COVID as we were setting it all up, which feels like a very compressed window of time. I'd have to go back and dig up, but I think we did a few weeks of very intense work on this that would normally take a year or two. So all faults are mine. And then we'll talk just a couple of things about things we want to develop in the future in terms of patient involvement on the project. And then I want to leave plenty of time for questions, feedback, and ideas from the folks on this call. And obviously Mark will be in the background for anything that's more operational, and Emma's there too. So yeah, I'm afraid the number of questions I can answer is probably limited to PROMs and PPI. Okay. So to back up a second, let's say you're unfortunate enough to be unwell with a condition that does not have a curative treatment and does not have very effective therapy. So your choice is potentially to volunteer for research, and it may well be that your doctor asks you if you'd like to take part in a study. You may see some advertising online, and you come across these opportunities where basically a massive corporation, big drug company, is seeking your altruistic time and attention for a sort of research position that's almost like an unpaid job, right? So you're going to be asked to do lots of things. And if you are successful, if you're enrolled in this, we're going to, we're really selling it to you here. You're going to have to travel long distances. You're going to have to get up early in the morning and, get in the car and drive off to some hospital with an inadequate car park. You might have to get prodded and poked and scanned. If you already underwent all those tests when you're being diagnosed, I'm afraid you have to do them again. So, if you fear of small spaces, sorry, we're putting you back in the MRI scanner. Or if you don't like needles, sorry, there's lots of needles. If you're already on some sort of stable treatment, we might have to take you off that. We might have to wash you out. If you've got something really awful, you might have a terminal illness, you might have something that causes you a great deal of pain, a great deal of stigma. Well, we're going to give you a set of questionnaires that sort of say, on a scale of 0 to 10, how awful is this thing, right? So it can be quite impersonal. And then you have to arrange all your own transport, right? So, and I'm a caregiver to a family member with motor neuron disease. So when we have to take my father-in-law down to Oxford to go and see the clinical trials team, it actually affects about 9 people to get one person down to clinic, just to, have a 20-minute chat with a neurologist and fill out half an hour of forms. So, when you look at a standard clinical trial, it's actually a pretty challenging proposition to people, and you can understand why it can be difficult to recruit. We've also got this issue that's very contentious in many conditions, that there's often a placebo, so that even if you go through all this, because there's this mysterious thing we don't understand called the placebo effect that the scientists haven't figured out yet, you may have the pleasure of going through all this for what essentially feels like a bit of a sham, bit of a charade, which I think is really distressing for people, who are living with very serious conditions. Just to top it all off, just to make this sound like a really grim proposition, let's say the study is complete. Let's say the research is successful. When are you going to hear about those results? So it may be that you hear about the results from your doctor. More often than not, participants in clinical trials hear when there's a press release out. It's not unusual for patients, unfortunately, even with implantable medical devices, to hear a press release that, oh, this implantable device didn't work, right? If they want to read the PDF of the study in which their data was in, the journal publishers might say, sure, it's going to be $50 to read that journal article for 24 hours. So when you look at, say, a very traditional site-based clinical trial, actually, I would say that it doesn't feel very patient-centric in the way that we've traditionally been doing them. And I'm parroting this a little bit, but actually, my experience in supporting trials in MS and Parkinson's and ALS has been that this is frequently how it's characterized. So I think there's a sense that this is not fair. This is not a just social contract that we really have with research participants. And the literature is full of researchers going, why is it so hard to recruit into our studies? Even before COVID, half of clinical trials in oncology, say funded by the big US cancer funders, didn't recruit a single patient, not one. The vast majority of trials under-enroll, have large attrition, large dropout, large missing data. And, a lot of the questions are being asked, why aren't participants doing this, doing this, doing this? I think it's time for researchers to say, well, why can't we make this fairly awful sounding job a little bit more palatable, a little bit more convenient? And then, people might be more willing to take part. So that's really the crux, from my view, of patient involvement. It's about sharing participation, sharing power with the people affected by the decisions we make. There's a very useful framework that I like a lot called Arnstein's Ladder. It was originally about community development. Do you want them to build a giant Tesco on the village green, or would you rather have a children's playground? But I think it actually works quite well in this medical context as well. So at the lower levels, you have, say, non-participation between people that have power, say at a hospital or a pharmaceutical company or something like that, and the population. And at its worst, this would be being untruthful to people. So, within here, we'd have some of the worst historical episodes of medical malpractice and ethics case studies like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, right? So clearly, this is a very challenging area that we're all living through the consequences of that in a lot of the paperwork that we all have to do, right? In the middle, we have tokenism. Tokenism is a very loaded word. But within there, so informing would just be saying, hey, we're going to build a giant supermarket on your village green. There's a leaflet through the door telling you it's happening. Consultation would be saying, hey, would you like to come to the village hall and see the little model of the Tesco we're building on your village green? Placation might be, all right, we'll put a kids swing set on the side, and we'll set aside some disabled parking bays and stuff like that. But it's still a degree of tokenism, and it's better than nothing. It's better than lying to people, clearly. But I think this is one of the criticisms that can come across. At the higher levels, what I think we should be aiming to work towards is probably aiming more towards partnership at the very least. Well, to say, well, let's work with the people who the decision is going to affect, and it's beyond buy-in. It should actually be giving up some power, and this is the ideal that we'd be reaching towards. In some cases, in some trials, there are some oncology trials, some rheumatology trials, some rare disease trials, where actually trial designers have said, look, group of mums of children with a rare disease, we're going to put you in charge of writing the patient information and recruitment materials, so that you really put it in the way you would speak normally, or to say, well, we've got the official translations that have gone through compliance and legal, but you need to translate it into US Spanish, because you understand the nuances, you understand the cultural issues, and we'll actually give you responsibility for that. And at the top level actually is citizen control. So I guess in the Tesco version, this is actually saying that the community itself controls what it does with its land. And maybe they invite different people to bid for its use depending on what they need. And there are actually parallels for that in clinical research. So just to pull out a couple of examples. So at the very bottom here, there are bad actors that have been in the pharmaceutical industry historically. Ben Goldacre writes very engagingly about this in his book, Bad Pharma. At the level of tokenism, there was a program within the FDA that only existed because HIV advocates in the 1980s literally chained themselves to the railings and started pill parties where they would mix up all their trial medication from all different sites on a big table and all start taking it. And the FDA put in a program where patient advocates could come and join various panels, but in the 20 years that they were operational, there were only sort of 100 patients or something like that through the program. It was very arduous to get in, so you didn't have any conflict of interest, but really it was quite tokenistic. Now that's improved since the Obamacare Act came in a few years ago, so there is now a patient-focused drug development office at FDA, but it's still unclear about whether or not that patient involvement's really affected any decisions. So again, accusations of tokenism there and at other places. Where we hope there are some positive examples of sort of delegated power. One example is a tick mark you may occasionally see at conferences called patients included. And that means that patients with lived experience of a condition, or their caregivers or their family, have been involved in designing the agenda of a conference, that they are speaking on stage, that they've been invited with their expenses paid to be in the audience. And there are patients included check marks for journals, for medical education events, and maybe for other things in the future, but that sort of you have to meet a set of criteria in order to use that. One very prominent example in medical research is the BMJ. I've done some work with them on their editorial board about trying to get more patient input into what journal articles get published. And clearly researchers are very interested in the whole pipeline at the beginning with funding and at the end with publication. So a brilliant way of making sure that patient involvement really has some teeth is to put it at those gate points. So within the BMJ, if Mark was to write a paper about pulmonary hypertension and send it to the BMJ, it would get reviewed by probably at least one person who has pulmonary hypertension. Now, the aim is not that layperson is reviewing the statistics or seeing if he's done his Bonferroni corrections. It's to sort of give their view of, well, is this trial about measuring something that's truly important to me? Are the outcomes relevant? Is a difference of 2 percentage points? Does that mean anything for my life? Does that mean I can walk up and down stairs? Or is it just a nice little statistical graph that someone's made? And then finally, these examples of citizen control. In the world of diabetes, there are people living with diabetes who have actually hacked their own continuous glucose monitors, their own insulin pumps, and have jerry-rigged software using open source code shared on Facebook and other groups to actually run their own closed-loop artificial pancreases, which sounds quite scary, but actually has got some pretty interesting outcomes. And there's probably in the neighborhood of 4,000 or 5,000 people right now on Earth living with these sort of cobbled together external cyborg infrastructure, all made by patients. And yeah, they basically, the reason they're called We Are Not Waiting is because the medical device manufacturers would say, yeah, we've got that on our roadmap. It's about 5, 10, 15 years out. And people who say have children with type 1 diabetes decided we are not waiting. The other example I'd give is I am ALS. So I mentioned I work in motor neuron disease earlier. It's also called ALS in the United States. You might remember the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge. It's that. I'll talk about that just in a sec. But the ALS patients are taking on the mantle of the HIV advocates of the 1980s. So one of the things that happened in the world of ALS, again at this extreme, is a few years ago that patients actually started coming to the website that I worked with called Patients Like Me, and they started entering their data whilst they were in clinical trials to try and work out if their drug was working or not. And it was an unusual and unpredictable sort of hack that they made of the medical system. They actually started self-experimenting in what was called participant-led research, which may have some parallels later on in COVID-19, where they would read the scientific literature, see what was a promising phase 2, and then try and run their own experiment by asking their GP to prescribe them drug off-label to see if it would work. In this example, there was a small Italian study suggesting lithium might halt the progression of ALS, a condition with an 18-month prognosis. So as you can imagine, people weren't going to wait the 5 years for the formal trials to all read out. And from that initial study in Italy of 16 patients, the patients on the internet got together 160 patients that could all manage to take lithium and track their outcomes. And actually they figured out in about 6 to 12 months, the drug probably doesn't work. So that was a very unusual thing. Again, these ALS patients now are advocating very strongly. They are lobbying the FDA to speed up expanded access programs. They're lobbying drug companies on social media to open up access to drugs. And they're even going up and saying to drug companies, hey, nice trial you've got there. Be a shame if no one in our community was to join it. And these are their slides. They are literally saying, look, if you make a patient-centric trial where you support us and there's expanded access and there's not too much placebo and we can see that you're trying to be as inclusive as possible, we will push your trial. We will try and get as many people as possible to sign up. If you don't, we'll blacklist you. So again, the ladder is not to say that the top is good and the bottom is, well, clearly the bottom is bad, but to say there's possibly a range, and that I think where patient involvement sits is ideally for the situation we're talking about, is really in that partnership space where we're listening to people. And more than just listening to people, but actually really involving them and getting them involved in the work. So, to be practical for a second, what are the potential outcomes for this? What are some of the arguments used about why, a giant 100,000 person pharmaceutical company should listen to, a handful of advocates with a condition? So there's been work on the commercial side from CTTI that have done some health economics work on this and actually suggested that, the likelihood of increasing a successful readout of a trial and then a patent and then a launch, it's such a substantial upside that the ROI is 500-fold. Now, an academic study that was more systematic and looked at more academic-led things that were not so financially motivated had a less striking finding. But again, it's a significantly improved chance of improved enrollment and retention relative to if you don't do it. And the types of things that can be applied fairly systematically. So here is an approach using just surveys that I've done about 30 times with drug companies, academics, clinicians, is basically to take a protocol, even if it's in draft form, boil it down to the 12 or 15 bullets that participants can process that's involved in their life. So, for example, you don't need to say, we're going to run this type of blood chemistry and this type of blood chemistry. And this. You just say how many blood draws they would need, and is it coming from their arm or is it coming from a finger spot or whatever, and to have these big ticket items. What is the aim of this trial? How long do I have to be involved for? How often do I have to visit a study site? And for each element to say, does this element of the study, it's 2 years long and it's to moderate your symptoms, versus it's 1 year long and it's to try and halt your disease. Does that make you more likely to be interested in taking part or less likely? And then you can sort of add additional feedback. And the typical things that come through are, I want some support to transport myself there, have my caregiver supported. I want a lunch voucher, for Wi-Fi. It's often a big request. There's lots sitting around. And, not all of us in every situation can do all of these things. But, in many situations, it does seem quite startling to patients when they hear about, a multi-million-pound study or a multi-billion-dollar drug launch, and they sort of go, well, why did I have to take the bus here? Great inconvenience. So anyway, not so much applying for our decentralized Heal COVID trial, but this is an example of the types of things. And when I first started doing this work, I didn't think big multinationals would actually listen to this. I thought they would say, okay, well, they said this word was complicated, we can simplify that word. But I've definitely experienced companies adding open label extensions, removing painful biopsy, simplifying the visit schedule, offering, you can have an Uber to the hospital purely off the basis of this type of feedback, because, they realize it's sort of good for them as well. So, when I try and persuade people that need more persuasion, I often try and say, what's in it for me as the, trial developer, and what's in it for me as the potential participant, and really aligning those things is where the potential is. Okay, so that was just a bit of background. So going into this specific study, and of course you're all at the sharp end of that. So why would we do or pay attention to and invest in PPI for this study? So very clearly we have got a lot of experts in the people designing the study, that are executing the study, that are giving us some continued feedback. But and I appreciate many of us may have had COVID-19, maybe to the degree of being hospitalized, maybe not. But we can't necessarily know what it's like to be them. And particularly, if we're from a minority population, or we have comorbidities, or we perhaps haven't had a ton of education, perhaps we're in a very challenging life situation. We haven't had those experiences, or the overlay and the intersections of all those experiences. So we really think it's key that listening to the lived experience of people is going to reveal something that we can't assume, we can't presume. Even if we've seen people in clinic or seen people in the wards, that's not the same as understanding how they live their lives. I think the other thing is, you may remember, and this feels like really going back a long time, back in the era of Thursday night claps and things like that, researchers who previously would be loath to collaborate with people down the corridor suddenly all came together in many cases with extreme enthusiasm. They felt frustrated that they were sort of on the bench just watching this unfold, particularly if they didn't have clinical skills. And so there were massive consortia, global consortia, crossing multiple continents and disciplines, and using methodologies like Delphi processes and other things to do a bunch of studies and research that would be published very rapidly on preprint servers like medRxiv, and they'd been done pretty well, given almost zero resources. So I think in terms of why for us, we certainly didn't want all that work to have been done for naught. And then finally, let's be practical. I hope I've made the case for you that patient involvement helps us get enrollees, helps them want to be adherent to data collection and to stay engaged in the trial. So I think we often start with the why, so that we can sort of let that drive through the rest of the work. So specifically, and I'm just going to do the sort of bigger ticket items here. There's a few more bits and pieces, but these are the bigger things. So first of all, very clearly, so myself engaged as a PPI lead, involved in the trial steering committee, and as the proposal and the protocol was coming together over a very busy period, trying to make sure that we would commit to having PPI sort of before, during, and after everything that went on. We went around and spoke to a lot of independent advisors and PPI leads at a number of universities to ensure that our strategy was sound, and that we had an approach that was going to work. When this had first all started coming together, just to remind everybody, it was pretty new to be doing these things on Zoom. Obviously now it's old hat and we live on the thing, or Teams or whatever. But yeah, there were questions there about consent and reimbursement and what have you that all had to be addressed. One of the things we knew we needed a sort of on-demand network for rapid review, and we were very lucky that the Cambridge University Hospitals PPI group was able to collaborate with us and make sure that the existing PPI group, that's I think about 25, 30 people with a great deal of experience in reviewing protocols, was able to give us rapid feedback. And we're really grateful for the work that they've done. They would give us very detailed feedback about things like elements of the consent form they might not understand, the Heal COVID website that you see, everything from the resources for participants to even the way that we have the terms and conditions for how their data can be used has all been passed and commented on and improved by patients. I mean, one example around our training videos. So I think Mark and others were involved in videoing these sort of staged, here's how you get consent type things. So patients actually read through, or potential patients read through the video scripts and pointed out sometimes things to do with language, like if you don't have any questions, let's move on, to say, well, actually, what questions do you have is a different way, open-ended, of sort of inviting questions. Or even something like, well, if you're going to come into the room and the potential enrollee is in bed, try and sit down on a chair and be at eye level with them, try and diffuse a little bit that power differential. So it's not just about sort of language and what color fonts or whatever. There were a bunch of unexpected findings, which is why we do this. Another area that was really key was the patient-reported outcome measures, or PROMs. I might say pros occasionally. Sorry, that's the Americanisms. Both in selecting them and deploying them. So, we were keenly aware that to only do this in English would be a great barrier to people who either don't speak English as their first language, or who prefer to speak their native language or another language when discussing medical things. So we drew upon data from the Office of National Statistics, to identify what other languages are spoken in the UK most frequently, and the list we came up with included Polish, Punjabi, Urdu, Bengali, and Gujarati. And so that became an additional consideration for the instruments that we developed. So we ideally wanted questionnaires that have been validated in those languages. And then finally, and I won't go into a lot of detail on this, but sometimes we would ask the panel, we would ask our experts, and we just didn't know what the right thing was to do. And so that's why, as a platform study, we've been able to do studies within a trial. One example of that, I won't remember the exact numbers off the top of my head, but the question was, for how long after someone has been enrolled would they be willing to fill out the questionnaires once a week? Is it 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks? Oh, there you go. Thanks, Mark. And we didn't really know. And we did a little survey to the PPI group, and they were split. So in the end, what we're doing is a study within a trial where a subset of people will only do them for 4 weeks, another subset will do them for 12 weeks, and we're going to look at the attrition. And we're actually going to try and work out, do you see this drop off in engagement because people are bothered by filling out questionnaires? Or is it relatively stable because people are being very sick, they're very grateful to be involved in research, they're very grateful to be giving back, and perhaps we will see, extraordinary engagement throughout this, but we'll be able to benchmark that against other studies and things like other health apps. A variety of approaches. Just a deep dive on some of the outcomes of interest, for example. So, as you'll know, the primary outcomes of this study are about readmission and mortality, and we're able to get that from NHS digital, electronic medical record data. But for everything else, as you can imagine, there are just dozens of potential things that we could measure. And this is a good example of one of those sort of collaborative projects. So this is the Tong et al. Core outcome set that was developed with input from hundreds of stakeholders, including a large number of people who had been affected by COVID-19 and experts in PPI. And they proposed a sort of 3-tiered approach. So tier 1 were core outcomes that were critically important and that they think absolutely must be measured in all trials. Tier 2 were things that were critically important to some stakeholder groups. And then tier 3 were important to some or all stakeholder groups. And you'll be familiar with just the huge heterogeneity of symptoms that people can experience. For the interventions that we're trying, though, some of those tail end symptoms are not things that we expect to modify, or they're not things that we're not trying to build a natural history study here. There is other work involved in that. So, the focus was on trying to narrow these down as much as possible. And just to give you a contrast, if one was to go and draw upon other expert societies who specialize in respiratory medicine before the times of COVID-19, the types of things they would recommend must be involved in testing people's respiratory outcomes is a pretty big battery, actually. So, people may have talked about attention problems and memory problems and executive function, stuff like that. I totally agree. I'm a neuropsychologist, very important. But functionally, we can't have a neuropsychologist administering it to however many 500 people we've just enrolled. It's just not possible. Things like anxiety and depression, very important, much easier to screen for. But things like a 6-minute walk test, very challenging to implement, even with remote technology, even with wearables and all the rest of it. So we certainly took a close look at these, but unfortunately they weren't the perfect answer. Similarly, looking at recommended outcome measures in acute respiratory failure, another interesting parallel. Again, just look at the number of questions here that they would really like you to have. Plus, there are some cost implications, right? So you actually have to pay a license fee for some of these instruments. And, you could imagine when it comes to attrition and burden, particularly for people who are, by definition, fatigued, that giving them a really long burdensome battery is not going to be good. So, one of our pieces of work was to map these core outcomes. So you can see here the 1, 2, 3 on the left, and then again to the other learned societies, and to first of all just focus on the patient-reported ones, right? So patients can't tell you if they're in multi-organ failure. That's not a patient-reportable thing. That's for the clinicians, but they can tell you about their cough. And so what we want to understand is, well, how important is cough? We know cough at the beginning, especially, was quite a useful symptom for diagnosis. Do we expect the treatments in Heal COVID to massively modify cough and therefore modify mortality? Well, not really. So we know it's there, but are we going to spend a lot of time on it? Probably not. I'm literally hand waving because it isn't an exact science, but these are the types of things we have to consider. And one would hope that there is just a big array of questions and it's really easy to just pick them out of the cloud. Unfortunately, it's not. Even for something like breathlessness, here are all the different ways you can ask about breathlessness. Some ask, how are you doing today? Some ask, how have you been the last week? Some ask, how have you been the last 30 days? And as I'm sure you'll know much better than me, that question could be different between breakfast and lunchtime for people at different stages and different severities. Some questions ask about how severe is it? Some people say, how much could it impair your function? And they all have different sort of ways of doing this. So as you can imagine, it'd be quite challenging to mush it all together. And that's just for breathlessness. So then throw in fatigue and depression and all done in different ways. Going to be quite challenging. One item that we've used, I'm not sure, I don't think it's for the first time, but certainly we're one of the early adopters. So the same group that made those core outcomes recognized that there was not a suitable patient-reported breathlessness instrument specifically for dyspnea as a result of COVID-19. And so they got together and made a recommended modification to the MRC scale. So you may have seen this in the protocol, the questionnaire. Again, it's imperfect, but my hope is that we might be able to get at, with a single question, something that is familiar enough to the pulmonary folks, because it's similar to the MRC, simple enough that it hasn't caused a big burden for participants, but that it might have some differentiating function that we could look at with the other questions. And you might argue certainly about well, what if people don't walk for 100 yards, or what if they think they're between there a 1 and a 2. That's always the case with every single questionnaire. So we're sort of going to be looking at this carefully. But again, this was an instrument developed with patient input. And so one of the clear conclusions we had in developing all this and hearing from participants, and obviously we're very engaged trying to read what was going on in social media, read what was going on in the Facebook groups, talking to patients and potential participants, was to keep the number of questions down to a minimum. As a researcher, it pains me how brief these are. When I used to test ALS patients with my neurocog battery, we did 8 hours of testing. 8 hours per participant. I feel very bad for it now. This is the set of PROs I have for another trial in motor neuron disease. It's 3 or 4 hours for a study visit. So when I say we worked very hard to make a very small number of questions to reflect what we thought was important to patients in a way that would minimize their burden, hopefully you can see that reflected here. So we have prioritized space for the things that we think are the most important. So clearly fatigue is something, it comes up a lot. It may be that some of these interventions we're using may have an impact on that. And so giving more weight to the severity versus the frequency versus the impact for that breadth of understanding of fatigue seemed more important. I've already shown you the modified MRC dyspnea scale. There's also a single item, to what extent have you been able to get back to your usual activities item that was sort of developed in a similar way. For depression and anxiety, I think you saw the HADS on a previous scale, that the PHQ and the GAD are well recognized, well validated screeners. So this is not in great depth. All we'll be able to say at the end of this are people in clinically significant levels of distress or not. We won't have the real richness. But to do that, you'd have to add 7 items to the PHQ or 6 items to the GAD. And so we've really tried to absolutely cut it to the bone. One area we thought was interesting, and again, you'll have seen this more than I have, would be for patients who've been ventilated or been on a ward with lots of other people that didn't make it. They may be suffering from a degree of trauma. And so we thought it was important to have a validated instrument for this. So this is a civilian version of a PTSD checklist, the screener for that. The EQ5D is a very well-known quality of life measure. I think that'll be very understandable and translatable in a range of settings, including health economics. So this is what NICE uses to determine whether or not something's paid for. We're also conscious we may cause harm when we give people interventions. And so we wanted to look at the tolerability of particular interventions we were using. And then because there were still these extra symptoms that we were hearing about a lot that we thought were important, we had to sort of craft our own way of asking about these items that's in a very similar framework to that FACET questionnaire. And that means that it's got psychometric validity to the way in which it's been asked. But if you're hearing anything back from people about these questions, then we should do that. So people ask me, how did we get this done in what was in the course of probably 2 or 3 weeks? First of all, everyone was amazing. We started with sort of pre-apologies before our asks, but people were very kind for turning things around very, very quickly. I really felt, I don't know if you still feel it, but there was definitely a wave of feeling that researchers were breaking down a lot of boundaries in order to sort of get things done and get things moving, particularly for interventional studies. I was getting email responses in minutes from professors that owned instrument licenses and stuff like that, when in other settings it takes 6 months of chasing them through various means to get their responses. And long may that continue, but we were very lucky. Everyone we spoke to in the beginning stages, so I may have overthought some of this and was thinking, how are we going to get a statistically representative cross-section of the population from England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, from every possible representativeness of ethnicity, and make sure all the comorbidities or whatever. And a number of people said, okay, you're not going to do that in the time that you have with the resources that you have. Get started, and we can work some of the rest of it out. And we certainly took that to heart. I hand waved a little bit earlier. I don't want to make out completely like we were winging it. We certainly followed a lot of the key guidance that's out there. So there are a number of toolkits. Actually, I think Carol Gamble, who's very closely involved in the study through the Liverpool CTU, is a co-author on that work. And of course, all the work that NIHR, particularly the Involve subset, have done on how to actually do this, particularly in the UK, has really been key. Okay, so what a perfect picture I've painted. All you have to do is listen to the patients and everything will come up roses. Well, it's not always that easy. I think we are conscious that it's not always fast enough, it's not always quick enough, it's not always good enough, it's not always representative enough. I think it's quite easy to say. Obviously, if we had more time, money, and attention, and there were sort of shifting priorities and things like that, one could have done more. And I think we want to. This is saying this is an ongoing process. Right? We are continuing to commit to this. A surprise for me. Again, you'll know this better than I do. Wave 1 people are not the same as wave 2 people, are not the same as wave 3 people. So in the past, when I've gone into Parkinson's disease, I say, oh, the average person is this old and this proportion of men, and this is where they tend to live. The typical COVID-19 participant who we thought we had when we were drafting the protocol in its first version was not the same as the wave 2 participant who showed up and was enrolled. So it may be that many of the assumptions that I've made here about the symptoms or the timing or whatever, we may have missed the mark because the disease changed. I really don't know how you can adapt for that without tons of variations in protocol and stuff like that. But the key outcomes are still the key outcomes. I think there's inherent biases and a lack of diversity in our own teams and institutions. I don't just mean that for whole COVID, but I mean the universities we work in, the hospitals we work in, the funders. There are lots of folk that all look the same. I think if we are going to look critically at how this is all done, I think it should certainly be in terms of the representation of who was actually most affected by this disease, and was there a sufficient representation of them in the study. The first time I was informed that somebody had signed up in the PROMS app in a language other than English, I felt very good, but we need to see, is that actually going to play out? So in terms of the future, so one of the things we want to understand, so obviously the 500-ish number that we're approaching is fantastic, but we don't know how many people were asked to get to that 500. And for the people that took part, we presume they're doing it because they want to be altruistic and they want to give back and whatever. But there's a little problem of bias here. So if anyone's done statistics, you may have seen this graphic before, but this is from World War II, and the Allied command was having these shaky B-17s and Lancasters or whatever coming into land riddled with bullet holes, and they were looking where all the bullet holes were falling and going, gosh, we ought to put more armor there. Look, everyone's shooting up the wings. We should put more armor there, and then they'll land a bit better. Till, of course, some bright spark stepped in and went, hang on, we're only seeing the planes that are landing. So if they got bullet holes through that part of the wing, but they're managing to land, then obviously it's not that important. And so in the end, what you're supposed to do, and what they did do, is you actually put the armor on everywhere you don't find the bullet holes of the planes that returned. In a similar spirit, when we hear from participants that are using the app and engaging with you, we're only hearing about the people that said yes. And when, again, wave 1 first started, it was a different condition. We didn't have people with vaccine skepticism and disease skepticism and other things that I think we couldn't anticipate. And so probably now more than ever, we need to understand what barriers may exist for people to not want to enroll in research like this. I could certainly appreciate they might be younger than in wave 1, and so maybe they're busy, they've got more responsibilities, but equally if there are issues there to do with research skepticism more generally, or even COVID skepticism like we see in the United States to a very different degree, I think it would be helpful for us to know about that. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to tailor any changes in approach. So I can't remember if this has been implemented just yet, but we're planning to, with the next set of amendments, actually create some materials to give to people who have been asked to enroll but decide not to. Completely optional for them, but we're giving them the option to get in contact with us, and they'll be able to drop us an email, fill out a survey. If they want to, I will schedule a 15-minute phone call with them. If they want to rant, I will listen to their rant very calmly. If they want to say, hey, I just didn't have time for this, or it was scared of drugs or whatever, that will all be useful information. But we want to hear from the people that opted not to take part, to understand, is there something we can do about that? Or, have we missed the mark, or, is it just situational? We're also going to try and add 2 lay members, not my favorite term in the world, but two people with lived experience of COVID-19, preferably somebody who has had quite a severe time, has been hospitalized, to join our trial steering group to actually give us that additional lived experience input and to be continually involved. They'll be reimbursed for their time. There's good guidance on this. If it's somebody with existing PPI experience, that would be great, but it doesn't have to be. And certainly they will be offered sort of training and support. I think we're particularly keen to find representation from people who aren't typically represented in research. So minority groups, we want to make sure that we've got representation from across the United Kingdom. It's very hard to do with 2 people, but that's certainly a consideration that we want to make, particularly as the study goes into its next phases. So I hope we've given a bit of a whistle-stop tour from the broader picture to the very specifics about this. I think some critics see PPI as kind of a box-ticking exercise and kind of grumble. I believe this is a thing that over the course of the next 5, 10, 20, 25 years will become normal. You wouldn't do a clinical trial without a statistician. I think in the future you wouldn't do a clinical trial without patient involvement, and I think the UK is really leading the way in a lot of ways across the world, and so I'm very excited to see what the future holds.